Block 1. The Childhood of Caligula and the Birth of Madness. Rome. Year 12 A.D. The imperial palace was a place of shadows. Long before Caligula was born, blood had already stained the marble corridors. Intrigues, betrayals, midnight whispers that traveled through stone walls. And in the middle of that chaos, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus was born, his name loaded with glory and expectation. The nickname came later. Caligula, the little soldier, because of the tiny military sandals he wore as a child while following his father on campaign. But behind the image of the smiling boy who made hardened legionnaires laugh, something darker was already growing. His father, Germanicus, was one of the most beloved generals of the Roman people. Brave, respected. Many saw him as the true successor to Augustus, but fate was cruel. Germanicus died young, under mysterious circumstances. Poisoned, some said. Betrayed, others whispered. Caligula was only 7 years old, and what remained for him was fear. After his father's death, his family was thrown into a spiral of persecution. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, openly accused Emperor Tiberius of orchestrating Germanicus's death. The result was destruction. Agrippina was exiled and died of starvation. 2 of Caligula's brothers also died in captivity. The young Gaius witnessed it all, saw soldiers taking his mother away, heard the muffled screams behind the palace walls, smelled the presence of death before reaching the age of 10. And one lesson burned into his mind. In Rome, trust is a fatal mistake. At just 17, Caligula was summoned to live on the island of Capri. Emperor Tiberius, old, paranoid, and cruel, took him under his wing, but Capri was no sanctuary. It was a private hell, wrapped in beauty. Amid lush gardens and palaces with views of the sea, the worst human behaviors unfolded: abuse, orgies, executions, torture. And Caligula watched it all silently. He learned to smile while hating, learned to be invisible while plotting. It was there, in the shadow of a decaying emperor, that the true monster was born. For years, he survived among killers and traitors. He watched senators executed over minor insults, saw nobles kill themselves out of fear from a simple accusation. And each night, Caligula went to sleep with one thought: if it's ever my turn, I won't be caught off guard. He became the master of disguise. He smiled, served, obeyed. But inside, he nurtured a hatred that grew like a disease. When Tiberius finally died, Rome breathed a collective sigh of relief, and young Caligula was called to power. The people welcomed him like a hero, cheered his name in the streets, saw him as the legitimate heir of Germanicus, the son of hope, the symbol of renewal. But no one, not even the most experienced senator, not even the wisest general, could imagine that this charming young man would bring to Rome an era of terror, madness, and blood. The boy in the little soldier's boots was now emperor, and Rome would never be the same. Block 2. The Rise of Caligula and His First Year of Rule. The False Hope. Year 37 A.D. Rome woke up to a new emperor. Caligula, young, charismatic, smiling. The people filled the streets, shouting his name. After years of fear under Tiberius, the Senate, the soldiers, even the common citizens believed that a new era of hope had arrived. Caligula was the son of Germanicus, the beloved general, the martyr of the Republic. He was the political grandson of Augustus, the heir who promised to restore Rome's dignity. In the first months, Caligula gave emotional speeches. He promised tax reductions, amnesty for political prisoners, the end of secret trials. He distributed food, organized public festivals, sponsored games at the Colosseum, and the people rejoiced. New coins were minted with his face, with phrases like the light of Rome and the sun of fortune. The Senate, eager to please, granted him honors, privileges, and new titles. Everything seemed perfect. But then came the fever. A few months after taking the throne, Caligula fell ill. A high fever, delirium, constant vomiting, and days of unconsciousness. Rome plunged into panic. Thousands of citizens ran to the temples, offered sacrifices, made promises, begged the gods to spare the emperor's life. Senators, generals, everyone hoped for his recovery, because deep down they knew that if Caligula died, Rome would fall once again into succession chaos. But the young emperor survived, and when he opened his eyes again, something inside him had changed. His closest servants were the first to notice. His gaze was different, colder, emptier, more unpredictable. Caligula, who once smiled easily, now smiled at the strangest moments. During audiences, he spent long minutes silent, staring as if measuring the fear on the faces before him. His former allies began to shiver just at the sound of his name. The first strange decisions soon appeared, contradictory orders, sudden executions with no apparent reason, laws changing overnight, and the Senate, who had once seen him as a savior, now saw him as a dangerous enigma. One morning, during a meeting with senators, Caligula suddenly burst into loud laughter. For no reason, when a senator asked what amused him so much, Caligula replied with terrifying calm, "I was just thinking how many of you could die today, and how Rome wouldn't miss a single one." The hall fell into a deadly silence, and in that moment everyone understood. The false hope was over. The real Caligula had just been born. Block 3, the beginning of tyranny, the first persecutions and executions. The year was 38 A.D. Rome still held on to the fragile relief of Caligula's recovery, but what seemed like a blessing soon revealed itself as a curse. The emperor was no longer the same. Mornings began with lists, names scribbled on scrolls, senators, knights, even ordinary citizens. Caligula, read each name with a disturbing smile. This one, because he looked at me strangely. That one, because he didn't applaud enthusiastically enough. Reasons, they no longer mattered. Only his will. The first victims were discreet. A senator found dead in his home. Another disappeared after leaving a banquet, but soon the violence became public. Executions became staged events. Caligula watched them like theater. He sat high above, surrounded by guards, while the condemned were beheaded, strangled, or thrown to wild animals, and always with the same gaze, cold, empty, unpredictable. The Senate lived in panic. Every meeting felt like a game of Russian roulette. Nobles exchanged silent glances. They knew that at any moment they could hear their names spoken in Caligula's calm, cruel voice. Some tried to flee Rome. Others sent gifts, bribes, promises of eternal loyalty. But nothing guaranteed safety. Caligula began to test the limits. He summoned senators in the middle of the night, just to watch them sweat while waiting for a sentence. On one occasion, during a banquet, he ordered a long-standing senator to be whipped, right there in front of everyone, and when someone questioned the reason, Caligula simply replied, "Because I can." But it wasn't just the nobles who suffered. The people also began to feel the weight of imperial madness. Taxes increased. Absurd fees were created. Any criticism, no matter how small, became a death sentence. Even the games changed in tone. During Colosseum shows, Caligula randomly selected people from the audience and threw them into the arena to die in front of their own neighbors. Meanwhile, the city sank into a strange silence. Artists stopped composing. Poets stopped writing. Conversations in taverns became whispers. Rome as a whole walked as if stepping on broken glass. And at the center of it all, there he was, Caligula, the boy who survived the terror of Capri. Now spreading terror himself, the emperor who was beginning to prove that madness, when mixed with power, becomes a poison, irreversible. Block 4. Megalomania and the Delusions of Grandeur. The year was 39 A.D. Caligula now had no limits. Power had eaten away what little sanity remained. His mornings were filled with theatrical audiences, his afternoons with public punishments, and his nights with endless banquets drowning in wine, delusions, and humiliation. But the most frightening thing was not just his cruelty. It was the transformation of a man's mind who now believed he was more than human. Caligula began to compare himself to the gods. He ordered statues of himself, modeled after Jupiter, Mars, and Apollo. He demanded that citizens worship him as a living deity. Priests were forced to perform public prayers in his name. Altars began to appear, with offerings not to the traditional gods, but to him. In one of his fits of vanity, he ordered the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill to be remodeled. Why? Because Caligula wanted his own statue to stand in Jupiter's place. The architects hesitated, but under the threat of execution, they obeyed. The excesses didn't stop there. Caligula launched massive construction projects, driven by pure megalomania. He ordered the building of an artificial bridge linking Baiae to Puteoli, using warships lined up as the foundation. The reason, a prophecy, said he would never cross that stretch of sea. Caligula crossed the bridge on horseback, dressed as Alexander the Great, laughing, defying the gods, and logic itself. In the following nights, during banquets, he retold the story, laughing uncontrollably, as if it were a personal victory against fate. But perhaps the most infamous episode was the one involving an animal, his horse. Incitatus. Caligula loved him like an equal. He ordered a marble stable built for him, fed him oats mixed with gold, and, according to some accounts, even announced that he would appoint him senator. Some historians say it was just a joke, but for those living in Rome, there was no longer a way to tell when the emperor was serious and when he was lost in yet another fit of madness. And while all this happened, Rome's coffers emptied. To fund his whims, Caligula raised taxes, confiscated inheritances from wealthy families, and, in some cases, simply declared people guilty of imaginary crimes to seize their properties. The people who once cheered him now walked with lowered heads. The streets had a new survival rule. Don't look the emperor in the eye. Don't question his orders. Don't breathe too loudly in his presence. But behind all that facade of a god, of a king, of an absolute ruler, Caligula began showing signs of something even more dangerous. Paranoia. He saw betrayal in every shadow, suspected conspiracies in every averted glance, and in the coming weeks, that paranoia would turn Rome into an even bigger stage of blood. Block 5, Paranoia and Fear. Imaginary betrayals and the first plans for conspiracy. Year 40 AD. Caligula's gaze was no longer the same. Before there was arrogance, cruelty, even dark humor. Now there was only distrust. Every room he entered, he scanned as if expecting an ambush at any moment. The emperor started seeing enemies everywhere. Nights grew longer. Caligula barely slept. He wandered the palace corridors, talking to himself, interrogating guards, obsessing over rumors, real or imagined. Any piece of gossip, no matter how small, was treated as undeniable proof of conspiracy. The first targets were those closest to him, childhood friends, old allies, men who just months before had toasted at his side. Now they were dead. Accusations? They hardly mattered. A single doubt, a whisper, even a bad dream, and Caligula ordered execution. In one of the most shocking cases, he commanded that an entire family be wiped out. Parents, children, even household slaves. The reason? An anonymous letter, unsigned, claiming that someone in the family had made a joke about the emperor. The Senate sank into terror. Senators began skipping meetings. Some faked illnesses, others fled the city, hoping the storm would pass. But with Caligula, there was no escape. His network of informants grew daily. Servants, soldiers, even neighbors. were rewarded for any piece of information. No matter how absurd, the people lived in silence. The forums emptied. The taverns fell silent. Laughter disappeared. Rome became a city of lowered eyes and hurried footsteps. And while Caligula drowned in paranoia, on the other side, something began to grow. In silence, in the shadows, within the cold walls of the Senate, a few men started whispering. Cassius Chaerea, an officer of the Praetorian Guard, publicly humiliated by Caligula countless times, began gathering allies, other officers, disgruntled soldiers, even senators started attending discreet meetings. The reason? Simple. Survival. Because everyone knew if Caligula remained alive, no one would be safe. The first conversations were just complaints, ventings, exchanged glances. But as the days passed and the bodies piled up, the idea of a final solution became inevitable. Caligula had to die, but killing an emperor, even a tyrant, was an act that required courage, planning, and above all, absolute secrecy. And while the conspirators sharpened their blades, Caligula, high up in his palace, kept laughing, shouting, and playing with the lives of everyone around him, unaware that the end was already walking toward him. Block 6, the day of the assassination, the end of Caligula, January 24th, 41 A.D. Rome woke under a heavy, overcast sky. The wind blew hard, as if the city somehow knew what was coming. Caligula rose early. As usual, he wandered the palace halls, complaining, issuing absurd orders and humiliating servants just to start the day. That morning, a performance was scheduled at the imperial palace, followed by games and religious ceremonies. Caligula loved these events, not for the gods, but for the chance to be the center of attention. He walked toward the makeshift theater, accompanied by his personal guard and a few invited senators. The public waited eagerly. Among the crowd, they were there: Cassius Chaerea, Cornelius Sabinus, Lucius Norbanus, and a handful more, all armed, hiding short blades under their togas. Men who, until that day, had smiled at Caligula, lowered their heads, applauded his speeches. Now they were ready to kill him. During the ceremony, as expected, Caligula publicly mocked Chaerea, called him weak, made jokes about his voice, and finally challenged him. In front of everyone, Chaerea's face remained expressionless, but inside, his decision was set. That very day, imperial blood would be spilled. After the event, as Caligula walked through a side corridor, heading toward the baths, he was surrounded. Suddenly, before he could react, the first blade struck his back. His scream was brief. The emperor turned, looked into Chaerea's eyes, and before he could utter a word, the second blow landed, then the third, the fourth. The other conspirators rushed in. More than 30 stab wounds, some delivered out of rage, others out of sheer fear that he might still rise. Caligula collapsed right there, on the cold floor of a dark hallway, with no official witnesses, no ceremony, no glory. The man who had declared himself a god died like a simple mortal, but the terror didn't end there. After the assassination, the conspirators stormed the palace. They sought his wife, his daughter, and without hesitation killed them too. The order was clear. No heir must survive. Meanwhile, the people of Rome reacted with confusion. Some quietly celebrated, others feared the city would plunge into another civil war. The Praetorian Guard was divided, and in the midst of that power vacuum, one name began to emerge: Claudius, Caligula's uncle, considered by many a fragile, irrelevant man, now was the last piece in the line of succession. But that was another story, and so ended the life of Caligula, the boy who grew up surrounded by blood, who learned to hate, who fed on the fear of others, and who, in the end, became exactly what he feared most: a victim of his own madness. Block 7. The consequences of Caligula's death: fear, instability, and the rise of Claudius. Rome was in shock. News of Caligula's death spread like wildfire in taverns, marketplaces, forums. People whispered with fear and with relief. Some mourned. Others thanked the gods, but the truth was undeniable. Rome was now without an emperor. The Senate saw this moment as a chance to regain lost power. They rushed to assemble, debated for hours. Some wanted to restore the Republic. Others suggested a new form of government. But while they argued, the city descended into chaos. The soldiers of the Praetorian Guard felt the power vacuum. They who had lost so many comrades to Caligula's whims now wanted to secure their own future, and they knew the Senate would never protect their interests. They needed a new emperor, someone manageable, fragile, easy to control. And then all eyes turned to him, Claudius, Caligula's uncle, a man who for years had been the court's laughingstock. He stuttered, walked awkwardly, was seen as weak, harmless, even ridiculous. But that day, the unthinkable happened. While the conspirators still celebrated Caligula's fall, Claudius hid behind a curtain inside the palace. Legend says a simple Praetorian guard found him, trembling, kneeling, thinking he would be the next to die. But instead of executing him, the soldier knelt and shouted, "Ave, Imperator!" Within hours, other soldiers did the same. And just like that, without planning, without a clear political legacy, without speeches, Claudius was taken almost by force to the Praetorian barracks. There he was proclaimed emperor. The Senate tried to resist. There were debates, threats, but in the end the senators gave in. They knew that challenging the Praetorian Guard meant civil war, and Rome couldn't afford more bloodshed. Thus, with a reluctant political gesture, the Senate recognized Claudius as Rome's new princeps. The man everyone considered weak now held the greatest power in the world. And as torches lit the night, as Rome's streets still echoed with the recent deaths, a new era began, an era of uncertainty. Because if history had taught the Romans anything, it was that power always came at a price. Block 1. The childhood of Claudius, the emperor nobody wanted. Rome, 10 BC. While the city celebrated festivals, military conquests, and the splendor of an expanding empire, in a quiet wing of the imperial palace, a child was born, fragile, pale, and silent. His name was Tiberius Claudius Nero, later known simply as Claudius, the man nobody. Absolutely nobody ever imagined would rule Rome. From his earliest years, Claudius was seen as a disappointment. While other members of the Julio-Claudian dynasty grew up strong, eloquent, and ambitious, Claudius stumbled over his own words. He stuttered embarrassingly, dragged his legs when he walked, and suffered from muscle spasms that made others laugh at him during family gatherings. Palace banquets were always the same. His cousins, siblings, even the servants, mimicked Claudius's speech, just to provoke laughter. His uncles openly commented that he was a burden to the family. His own mother, Antonia Minor, once described him as a monster, one that nature began to shape, but forgot to finish, and his grandfather, Augustus, the most powerful man in Rome, used to say that Claudius existed only to make the gods laugh. The boy grew up isolated. While other noble youths received military training, oratory lessons, and learned the arts of politics, Claudius was left behind. He spent hours and tired days alone in the palace libraries, reading everything he could: history, geography, politics, military strategy. Books became his only friends. In their silent pages, Claudius discovered something that no one else in Rome seemed to notice. His mind was sharp, fast, analytical, but on the outside he remained the family's favorite joke. As a teenager, the humiliation only grew. While his older brother Germanicus was sent to lead troops on the frontiers, Claudius remained locked at home, treated like an invalid. On the rare occasions he tried to attend public events, he was met with suppressed laughter, whispers, and pitying glances. At family gatherings, state matters were discussed without him. When he tried to speak, he was interrupted, ignored, or simply ridiculed. But what no one realized was that this exclusion was forging something inside him: a cold patience, an ability to observe, understand, analyze. Without being noticed, Claudius learned every day the art of invisibility, and in silence he built a knowledge that one day would change his life. While Rome engaged in wars, betrayals, and bloody successions, Claudius survived on the sidelines. When his uncle Tiberius took the throne, Claudius stayed in the shadows. When his nephew Caligula began his reign of terror, Claudius once again remained distant, hidden behind his awkward appearance. The years passed, and that man, always ignored, always ridiculed, kept breathing. While many of Rome's most powerful men fell one by one, victims of their own ambition, Claudius didn't conspire. He didn't get involved in plots. He didn't seek power. He simply watched, and that was his greatest protection. As Caligula began executing senators on mere whims, as soldiers and ordinary citizens disappeared for minor offenses, many started to look at Claudius with a mix of pity and fear. Some considered him harmless. Others called him a lucky fool. But deep down, no one truly knew what was going on inside the mind of that man who had spent decades accumulating knowledge, patience, and a rare skill in Rome, the skill to survive while everyone else fell. And as Caligula's reign neared its collapse, Claudius remained in the same place, disguised as a fool, ignored by all. But very soon, fate would knock at his door in a way that even he could never have predicted. Block 2. Claudius in his youth, the man forgotten by history. Rome, 20s AD. While the young elites of Rome paraded through the Forum, delivering speeches and commanding legions in distant provinces, Claudius remained in the shadows. To society, he was invisible. At banquets, he sat at the farthest corner of the table. His stuttering voice was drowned out by guests' laughter. Whenever he tried to start a conversation, people looked away, or with a condescending smile patted him on the back, as if consoling a child. Even his own family continued to treat him as a burden. His grandmother, Livia, wife of Augustus, was ashamed of him. She forbade Claudius from participating in public ceremonies, afraid his presence would stain the family's image. His tutors considered him incapable of holding any political office, and the senators never even mentioned his name when the subject was succession or leadership. Isolated, Claudius retreated even further into his books. He spent hours, entire days, studying history, law, public administration, and especially the political tragedies of Rome itself. He obsessively read about civil wars, betrayals, power games, and little by little built a knowledge no one even suspected. He memorized laws, genealogies, diplomatic treaties, military campaigns. He became a scholar, hidden behind the mask of a fool, but with each new tragedy that struck his family, Claudius simply observed and survived. When Sejanus, the powerful prefect of the Praetorian Guard, fell from grace, Claudius was there watching and learning. When his brother Drusus died under mysterious circumstances, Claudius stayed silent. When Agrippina's sons were executed or imprisoned, he remained invisible. And when young Caligula rose to the throne, turning Rome into a stage of madness and fear, Claudius once again stayed distant, hidden behind his awkward demeanor. The years passed, and that man, always ignored, always ridiculed, kept breathing, while many of the most powerful men in Rome fell one by one, victims of politics and violence. Claudius didn't plot. He didn't scheme. He didn't reach for power. He simply watched, and that was his greatest weapon. When Caligula started eliminating senators on mere whims, when soldiers and citizens began disappearing for minor offenses, many began to look at Claudius with a mix of pity and unease. Some still thought he was harmless. Others called him a lucky fool. But deep down, no one truly knew what was going on inside the mind of that man who had spent decades accumulating knowledge, patience, and a unique survival skill in Rome to stay alive when everyone else was falling. And as Caligula's reign approached its breaking point, Claudius remained in the same place, disguised as a fool, ignored by all. But very soon, fate would pull him out of the shadows into the heart of Roman power. Lock 3, the Praetorian coup, from hiding to Emperor, January 24th, 41 A.D. Caligula's blood still stained the cold marble floors of the palace corridors. Rome was trapped in an eerie silence, a silence of fear and uncertainty. No one knew who the next emperor would be. The Senate nervously debated, trying to decide Rome's future. Meanwhile, the soldiers of the Praetorian Guard roamed the halls, hunting for possible heirs, conspirators, and traitors. And in this chaotic scene, Claudius hid. They say he took refuge behind a heavy curtain, trembling, his face dripping with sweat. Some accounts claim he was crying, others that he was whispering prayers under his breath. Maybe he was simply waiting for the inevitable. The sound of soldiers' boots echoed through the corridors until one of them pulled the curtain aside. Their eyes met. The soldier raised his sword, but instead of delivering the fatal blow, he knelt and with a firm voice shouted, "Ave Imperator." The gesture was like a spark. Within minutes, other soldiers arrived. One by one, they knelt before Claudius. The man once considered a fool by all of Rome was now being treated as the supreme ruler. The Praetorian Guard needed an emperor, and Claudius was the perfect piece. In a state of shock, he was carried, almost by force, to the Praetorian barracks. There the soldiers proclaimed him Princeps of Rome. When the senators heard the news, they panicked. Some tried to organize resistance. There were those who pushed for a return to the Republic, but the Praetorians made it clear any opposition would be treated as treason. Within a few hours, the Senate was forced to recognize Claudius as the new emperor, a man who'd never commanded an army, who had never delivered a public speech, who had never even dreamed of the throne, now carried on his shoulders the weight of the Roman Empire. That night, as torches lit the streets of Rome, while the people, confused, tried to understand what was happening, Claudius, lying in a room he never imagined occupying, closed his eyes, and for the first time in his entire life, he was no longer invisible. He was emperor. But deep inside, he knew that this was just the beginning, because in Rome, the throne was never a gift. It was a sentence. Block 4, the first days of government. Claudius's political struggle for survival. The corridors of the imperial palace still carried the smell of blood. When Claudius sat for the first time on Rome's throne, his gaze distant, his hands trembling slightly, his mind a storm of thoughts. He hadn't chosen this. He hadn't prepared for it. And without a doubt, the most powerful man in Rome didn't want him there. At his first official meeting with the Senate, the atmosphere was pure hostility. The senators entered the hall with lowered eyes, tense faces, but it was easy to sense their contempt. Some whispered, calling Claudius the paper emperor. Others bet he wouldn't survive his first month. Claudius knew this. He knew that in that room he had more enemies than allies. But what no one knew was that Claudius had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Years studying political history, years observing the mistakes of other emperors, years understanding how Rome truly worked behind the scenes. And now it was time to put all that knowledge into action. His first move was simple and brutal. He ordered that all those directly involved in Caligula's assassination be hunted down, tried, and executed. Even though he hated his nephew, Claudius knew he had to show that an emperor could not be murdered without consequences. The message was clear. Whoever kills a prince pays with their life. Next, Claudius threw himself into work, day and night. He personally reviewed reports. He revisited old laws. He summoned provincial governors for private audiences, and, to everyone's surprise, he showed a level of detail and knowledge that stunned even the most experienced senators. His mind was a sharp blade. Historical records describe Senate sessions where Claudius calmly corrected senators when they misquoted laws or treaties. Men who had spent their entire lives underestimating him now found themselves humiliated in front of the very man they once mocked. But danger didn't just come from the Senate. Inside the palace itself, intrigues began to brew. Servants, generals, courtiers, all testing the limits of the new emperor. Some tried to manipulate him. Others spread rumors that he wouldn't last long. And Claudius watched it all with the same silent stare he had cultivated all his life. He knew that every smile could hide a knife, that every piece of advice could be a trap, but now he held the power, and he was ready to use it. In the following weeks, Claudius did something few expected. He began to reform the administrative structure of Rome. He appointed new procurators, reorganized the courts, created departments to oversee tax collection. His goal was simple. If the throne is my prison, then I will govern like no one expects. But behind every decree, behind every signed law, Claudius continued to sleep with one eye open. He knew that at any moment the same fate that caught Caligula could come for him. And so, in those first days of his reign, while the city watched with curiosity and fear, the man no one wanted as emperor began his toughest battle yet, surviving on the throne of Rome. Block 5. Claudius's early reforms. Defying expectations and surprising Rome, the first months of Claudius's reign were a spectacle of expectations and surprises. The senators continued to bet that he would fail. They expected a disastrous government full of poor decisions public stumbles, and administrative scandals. But what came next was exactly the opposite. Within weeks, Claudius began acting with an efficiency few thought possible. He reorganized the courts, created new administrative positions, delegated responsibilities with precision. He started reducing delays in legion payments, a key move to prevent military discontent that had been growing in previous years. And, to everyone's astonishment, he personally presided over important legal cases. His memory was frightening. He knew the details of old laws, remembered names, dates, and legal precedents like a true master of Roman administration. Historical accounts describe Senate sessions where Claudius calmly corrected senators when they misquoted laws or misunderstood historical facts. Men who had spent their entire lives underestimating him now found themselves humiliated by the very man they had mocked for years. But the reforms didn't stop there. Claudius launched public works projects across the empire. He ordered the construction of new aqueducts, improving Rome's water supply. He reformed the port at Ostia, ensuring that grain shipments could arrive without delay, preventing future food crises. He improved the city's sewage system, a decision that, though lacking glamour, saved thousands of lives in the years that followed. And while doing all this, Claudius also turned his attention to the empire's provinces. For the first time in Roman history, representatives from distant regions like Gaul, Thrace, and even North Africa were invited to hold important positions in imperial administration. The emperor wanted to integrate the empire more fairly. Of course, this angered Rome's traditional elite, who viewed anyone outside the Italian aristocracy with pure contempt. But Claudius didn't back down. In a famous Senate session, when questioned by a conservative senator about why he was giving political voice to provincials, Claudius answered with calm but firm conviction, "Rome is not just the walls of this city. Rome is every man who sheds his blood and who honors this empire with loyalty." The chamber fell silent. That day, for the first time, some began to see Claudius not as a government accident, but as a leader with a vision for the future. But while Rome began to admire his reforms, in the shadows of the palace, another kind of conspiracy was beginning to grow. Because no matter how intelligent, fair, or determined he was, Claudius still had one weakness he never fully learned to control: the people he trusted. And in the coming weeks, that weakness would start to cost him dearly. Block 6, Intrigues in the Palace, Wives, Advisors, and the First Signs of Betrayal. Rome breathed an air of apparent stability. Claudius's reforms had started to show results. The food supply improved. The economy showed signs of recovery. And for the first time in years, the city was free from arbitrary executions. But inside the imperial palace, the real war was just beginning. The problem was that Claudius, despite being wise in law and efficient in administration, had one weakness everyone knew and exploited: the people around him. He trusted too much in advisors, freedmen, and especially his wives, and none of them had a pure heart. His first great disappointment came with Messalina, young, beautiful, ambitious. Messalina was everything a powerful Roman woman needed to be, but behind the smile she hid an insatiable thirst for power and forbidden pleasures. While Claudius spent nights reading reports, Messalina hosted secret banquets with games, wine, and lovers. The city whispered scandalous stories. They said she competed with prostitutes to see who could have the most men in one night. Senators mocked her in private. Generals told crude jokes, and Claudius ignored it, or perhaps pretended not to know. But Messalina didn't stop at love affairs. She started manipulating political appointments. She placed friends, relatives, even lovers in strategic positions: governors, procurators, magistrates. Those who opposed her fell. Those who obeyed were rewarded. Rome began to divide between those loyal to Claudius and those who secretly pledged loyalty to the empress. Beyond her, there was another dangerous circle of influence: the freedmen, men who, in another time, had been mere servants, now controlled access to the emperor. Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus were the most feared names. Nothing reached Claudius's ears without first passing through them. They manipulated schedules, filtered messages, and often decided who lived and who died before Claudius even knew anything. The mix was explosive. On one side, an intelligent emperor, but emotionally vulnerable. On the other, an ambitious wife and a group of advisors, playing the power game behind the scenes. And in the middle, all of Rome watching and waiting. The first signs of betrayal began to appear, small decisions that contradicted Claudius's direct orders, malicious advice leading him into calculated mistakes. Senators started disappearing after mere meetings, and behind it all, Messalina smiled while the freedmen prospered. But Claudius was not as naive as many thought. He observed. He took notes. He remembered every offense, every betrayal, every glance that lingered too long. He knew he was surrounded by snakes, and deep inside, a decision was beginning to take shape. When the time is right, they will pay. Block 7. The Messalina Affair, the greatest public shame of a Roman emperor. The year was 48 AD. Rome buzzed with rumors. Stories about Messalina were no longer just servant whispers or tavern jokes. Now they were serious conversations in noble houses, senate corridors, and even among legion generals. The empress had crossed every limit. She was no longer content with discreet affairs. Her betrayals had become public. Men from all social classes, politicians, poets, even gladiators, were seen entering and leaving her chambers in broad daylight. And while Claudius buried himself in official documents, Messalina turned the imperial palace into a stage for scandal. But what happened next would shock even Rome's standards of decadence. Messalina decided to marry another man, and not in secret. She organized a formal wedding with the senator Gaius Silius. Complete ceremony, with witnesses, guests, music, and vows, while Claudius was away completely unaware of what was happening inside his own city. The news reached the freedmen in the middle of the afternoon. Narcissus, the shrewdest among them, turned pale when he heard the reports. A marriage? With a senator? With the empress still alive? And the emperor still on the throne? It was a political coup, simple and direct. Silius was ready to seize power. If Claudius didn't act, he would be deposed, humiliated, perhaps killed before the next sunrise. Narcissus rushed to Claudius. He found the emperor in his audience hall, surrounded by papers. When he heard the news, Claudius froze for long seconds. He simply blinked, trying to understand if this was a joke, a nightmare, or, indeed, reality. When he finally reacted, his first words were simple and full of pain. "But she loved me." But Narcissus knew there was no time for sentimentality. He took control of the situation. He summoned the guards, ordered the arrest of Silius and the other conspirators. The soldiers stormed the wedding venue with brutal force. Silius was dragged through the streets like a common criminal. Messalina fled to the palace gardens, seeking refuge. Claudius, still in shock, hesitated. He wanted to hear his wife, wanted an explanation, but the advisors knew that any moment of indecision could cost the crown and the emperor's life. The final order came from Narcissus without consulting Claudius. He sent an officer with clear instructions: execute her. Messalina was found sitting at the foot of a tree, her gaze lost, holding a dagger but unable to do what many expected. When the executioner arrived, she tried to run, but was caught and killed right there, silently, without farewells, without a public trial. That night Claudius sat alone in his chambers. No one knows for sure what he thought, if he cried, if he felt relieved, or simply empty. But one thing became clear to everyone in Rome. From that day forward, the man who once hesitated began to understand the true price of power, and Claudius's next decisions would be colder and more calculated. Block 8. The Conquest of Britannia, Claudius's greatest military triumph. The year was 43 AD. Rome was filled with anticipation. For the first time in nearly a century, an emperor would lead a military campaign outside Italy. The destination was distant, mysterious, an untamed Britannia, a land of mists, endless forests, warrior tribes, and legends that frightened even the most experienced soldiers. For years, previous emperors had avoided any attempt to conquer the territory. The reports coming from there spoke of violent barbarians, inhospitable weather, and a resistance that refused to bow, even before Roman legions. But Claudius saw in that campaign something more than just a military objective. He saw a chance to rebuild his own image. After the Messalina scandal, after years of being seen as a fragile emperor, he needed a victory, one that would enter history. Preparations were swift. 4 legions, tens of thousands of soldiers, ships, supplies, and immense logistics were mobilized. Experienced generals took command of the troops. But at the crucial moment, when the legions were already on British soil, when the first victories had started to emerge, Claudius did something unexpected. He personally traveled to Britannia. For many, the decision was seen as reckless. The emperor risking his life in enemy territory? But for Claudius, it was necessary. He wanted to be seen by the soldiers, by the senators, by the people of Rome. He wanted to prove he was not just an administrator, but a true leader. Upon disembarking, he was welcomed with honors. He marched alongside the troops, participated in military ceremonies, and in the decisive battle, he gave the final order to attack Caligula, one of the enemy's main fortresses. The victory was overwhelming. Accounts from the time describe Claudius entering the conquered city, dressed in his armor, surrounded by legionaries, cheered as a hero. Statues were erected in his honor, coins minted with his image, commemorating the conquest of Britannia. Rome erupted in celebrations when the news arrived. Upon returning to the capital, Claudius paraded in a triumph, one of the largest the city had ever seen. Lions, war prisoners, chariots, banners of defeated tribes, and at the center, the man who years before had been ridiculed by everyone, now acclaimed as the conqueror of Britannia. But behind the shine, the medals, and the celebrations, Claudius knew that Roman politics remained as dangerous as any battlefield, and that, soon, new threats would emerge. Inside his own palace. Block 9, the final years of Claudius. Manipulations, fear, and Agrippina's rise after the conquest of Britannia. Claudius finally seemed to have earned the respect he had sought his entire life. The people saw him as a legitimate leader. The generals called him a strategist, and even the Senate began treating him with a bit more reverence. But within the walls of the imperial palace, a new threat was already forming. Her name was Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina was Claudius's niece, daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula. She knew better than anyone the art of power. After the scandal and execution of Messalina, Claudius needed a new empress, and Agrippina seized the opportunity. With charm, intelligence, and a nearly clinical coldness, she seduced her uncle, gained his trust, and in no time began to control every aspect of the emperor's life. Her first maneuver was to secure the rise of her son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, better known as Nero. Agrippina convinced Claudius to adopt the boy, making him the legitimate heir to the throne. Claudius's biological son, Britannicus, was gradually pushed aside from the line of succession. Older advisors noticed the game. Some tried to warn the emperor, but Claudius was already old, tired, and, perhaps, resigned. The man who had spent his life fighting for respect was now surrounded by webs that he himself had helped weave. Agrippina took full control of the court. She decided who had access to the emperor, determined political appointments, and began to discreetly eliminate anyone who might oppose Nero's rise. Meanwhile, Claudius began showing physical weakness. The illnesses that had accompanied him since childhood now became more frequent. Fever spells, loss of appetite, moments of mental confusion, and, as if that weren't enough, he began to realize the size of the trap he had fallen into. According to some sources from the time and the final weeks of his life, Claudius confided to a small circle of allies that he regretted adopting Nero. There were rumors that he planned to disinherit the young man and restore Britannicus as direct successor. But Agrippina was faster. In the autumn of 54 A.D., during a banquet at the palace, Claudius began feeling ill shortly after the meal, vomiting, convulsions, labored breathing. Doctors were called in urgently, but many of them were already on Agrippina's side. The poison had done its work. Some reports say it was mixed with mushrooms, Claudius's favorite dish. Others claim that Agrippina herself supervised the delivery of the substance. The result was the same. That night, the man who had survived ridicule, humiliation, conspiracies, and scandals finally succumbed. He died alone, betrayed inside his own home. The next day, Nero was proclaimed emperor, and Rome entered a new and darker chapter of its history. Lock 10. The legacy of Claudius, the emperor who survived the impossible. The body of Claudius had barely grown cold, and Rome was already moving on. The streets filled with proclamations in Nero's name. New coins began to be minted. New promises of an even greater empire echoed through the forums. Few truly mourned, but in the shadows of history, one question continued to echo. Who really was Claudius? To many, he will always be remembered as the unlikely emperor, the man no one wanted on the throne, who was ridiculed, humiliated, ignored throughout his childhood and youth, the stuttering boy who trembled during family audiences, the teenager who grew up hidden behind books, while others marched off to glory, the adult seen as a puppet, manipulated by wives, freedmen, and advisers. But for those who look more closely, Claudius was more than that. He was the survivor, the man who, in the deadliest political jungle of the ancient world, endured, watched, learned, and, when the time came, ruled. Under his command, Rome expanded its borders, conquered Britannia, reformed the judicial system, improved public infrastructure, gave a voice to the provinces, and began administrative inclusion policies that would forever change the face of the empire. Claudius was never a warrior, never a great orator, never a charismatic politician, but he was intelligent, calculating, patient. He knew how to wait when necessary and act when no one expected. Until the end, he paid the price for trusting the wrong people. Messalina, Narcissus, Agrippina, all of them left deep marks on his reign. But even with mistakes and weaknesses, he left a legacy that would endure for generations. Historians still debate today. Was Claudius a lucky fool or a genius disguised as a clown? Perhaps he was both. Maybe that was his greatest trick, making the world believe he was weak, while inside he played a chess game where every move was for his own survival. And so the emperor no one wanted, the man once called a monster, a joke, an invalid, entered history as the one who survived where so many had fallen. The name Claudius would remain carved into Rome's stone, and in the corridors where he once walked, whispers would still echo for years. Never underestimate the one everyone calls weak. Block 1. Nero's dark childhood. Son of Rome, son of ambition. Rome, 37 A.D. While the people celebrated Caligula's rise to the throne, in a quiet corner of the city, far from the festivities and shouts of euphoria, a boy was born who would one day become one of the most feared, hated, and enigmatic figures in Roman history. His name, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. The world would come to know him as Nero. From the moment of his birth, his life was surrounded by shadows. His earliest days were marked by omens and distrust. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was an ambitious woman, cold and willing to do anything to secure a future of power for her son. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was violent, corrupt, and deeply hated even by his own allies. It was said that during her pregnancy, Agrippina visited hidden temples, made secret offerings, and performed rituals to bind her son's destiny to the throne. Little Nero grew up in an atmosphere of tension, fear, and manipulation, while other noble children were raised by kind tutors, with lessons in philosophy, music, and rhetoric. Nero was shaped with harsh words, cold stares, and cruel teachings. Agrippina made it clear, day after day, you were born to rule and to survive, even if you must destroy everyone around you. Slowly the boy began to understand that the world was a place of games and masks. He learned to hide emotions, to fake fragility when necessary, to observe silently the moves of the adults around him. His eyes became sharp, his mind a field of strategy. While others played, Nero listened to conversations, hiding behind palace columns, memorizing names, mentally recording every weakness of every person nearby. But what truly shaped Nero wasn't just his mother's coldness, it was also abandonment. After his father's death, when he was still very young, Nero was passed from one tutor to another. None of them cared for him. He was treated as a political obligation, just another name among many in the long line of forgotten heirs. He grew up hearing that he would never amount to anything, that he was just a distant nephew of Caligula, a name with no weight, a boy destined for obscurity. But Agrippina never accepted that fate. While her son was ignored, she plotted silently in the most dangerous corridors of Rome. She got close to influential allies, rebuilt her image after years of exile and humiliation, and when Claudius took the throne, she saw the perfect opportunity. Nero was only 7 when Agrippina launched her boldest plan to conquer the heart of the new emperor. While the city still gossiped about the scandal of Messalina's death, Agrippina became the new empress of Rome, and with that Nero went from forgotten boy to direct heir to the most powerful throne in the world. From that moment on, his education changed drastically. The best philosophers, the finest artists, the wisest rhetoricians were hired to mold him. Among them, one name would leave a lasting mark: Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, who tried in vain to teach virtue to the boy who carried from the start the scars of ambition and revenge. And so Nero, the boy of shadows, began his transformation. From rejected child to promising prince, from silent observer to future protagonist of one of the darkest and most tragic stories Rome would ever witness. Block 2. The Teenager and the Philosopher. Seneca's Lessons and the Birth of a Mask. Rome, 49 A.D. While the halls of the imperial palace echoed with intrigues, secret deals, and games of power, inside a well-lit room, a restless-eyed teenager listened with apparent patience to the words of a man who carried the weight of Stoic philosophy on his back. His name was Seneca, philosopher, orator, a political exile recently pardoned by Agrippina's order, and now official tutor of Nero. Seneca's mission was clear: to turn this boy, with an explosive temper and uncontrollable ambition, into a future emperor worthy of the throne. Moderate, just, balanced, Seneca dreamed of shaping the ideal prince, a philosopher king who would rule Rome with reason and virtue. But within the first few days, the philosopher realized that Nero was not an ordinary student. The young man listened to lessons with attention, memorized every phrase, repeated entire speeches with an impressive eloquence for someone his age. But Seneca saw beyond the words. Behind that fixed gaze there was a restlessness, a dark energy, difficult to control. Nero learned not out of love for philosophy, but out of pure calculation. He understood that to conquer Rome, he needed to appear as the perfect prince. Mornings were dedicated to rhetoric and politics, afternoons to history and philosophy. At night, Nero practiced singing, poetry, and theater. He moved easily between subjects, asked complex questions, challenged his teachers, and charmed everyone around him with sudden bursts of charisma. But in silent moments, when the tutors left, Nero returned to being the suspicious boy who spent hours walking alone through the corridors, with a lost gaze, planning something he himself couldn't fully describe. Agrippina watched everything from a distance. She wanted an obedient son, a tool for her own power. But little by little, she began to realize that she was creating something beyond her control. Nero was already showing signs of defiance. Sometimes he ignored orders. Other times he played small manipulation games between his own tutors. He tested limits, watched reactions, and learned quickly how to bend the wills of those around him. Seneca tried to warn Agrippina in discreet conversations. He suggested the boy needed more discipline, clearer boundaries, but she only smiled, convinced that a mother's love and political control would be enough to keep him on a short leash. Little did she know that the boy already dreamed of the throne. Meanwhile, Nero's popularity began to grow. People saw in him a well-educated, handsome, articulate young man. The public appearances, carefully orchestrated by Agrippina and Seneca, showed a sensitive prince who recited poetry, spoke of justice, and promised Rome a future of peace. The people began to fall for it, even some senators. Too, there was hope that when the time came, Nero would be a different kind of ruler, more human, more wise, less cruel. Little did they know that it was all just a mask, and so the teenager, the philosopher, and the empress moved forward in that delicate game of mutual manipulation, each with their own goals, each with their own secrets, and Nero at the center of it all, learning day by day that power often begins with the art of pretending. Lock 3 rise to the throne. The Emperor Rome believed it loved. Year 54 AD. The body of Claudius hadn't even gone cold, and there was already a new race for power. While the Senate debated, while generals whispered, and while the people still mourned, or pretended to mourn, one name started to echo through every corner of Rome: Nero. Agrippina moved with stunning speed. Even before Claudius's funeral rites were completed, she had already secured that Nero would be proclaimed emperor. She controlled the guards, controlled the official documents, controlled the closest advisors, and most importantly, she controlled her own son. At least, that's what she believed. The young man, barely 16, became the most powerful figure in the world. At his first public appearance as emperor, every word, every gesture had been carefully rehearsed. Dressed in light-colored robes, wearing a calm expression, and with a voice trained over years of rhetorical lessons with Seneca, Nero spoke of peace, of justice, and of hope. He promised the people a new era of prosperity. He promised the Senate respect and harmony. He promised the military loyalty and stability. And Rome believed him. The streets erupted with applause. Coins began circulating with the young, handsome face of the new emperor. Poets sang his praises. Orators exalted his early wisdom. Even the most skeptical senators admitted that Nero seemed to be the future Rome hoped for. In the first months, the government was surprisingly balanced. Seneca and Burrus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, handled the most delicate decisions. Agrippina insisted on being seen at her son's side at every important meeting, making it clear to all that she was the true hand behind the throne. But little by little, Nero began to change. His posture became more independent. He started holding meetings with other advisors without informing his mother. His nights grew longer, marked by parties, music, and secret encounters. And when questioned, the young emperor always answered with the same smile that for years he had learned to wear like a perfect mask. The Senate, initially relieved by the calm, soon began noticing small signs of unrest, decisions being made without consultation, unexpected appointments, favoritism towards artists, athletes, and unusual figures of society. The public image remained that of a wise and gentle ruler, but in the shadows, Rome started to sense the smell of something new, something growing inside the young emperor, something that not even Agrippina, Seneca, or Burrus would be able to control for much longer. And so the boy who was once ridiculed, the teenager who had learned to pretend, now walked through the halls of power with an increasingly distant gaze and a hunger that grew day after day, a hunger for something far beyond Rome's approval, a hunger for absolute dominance. Block 4, the fall of the mother, the conflict with Agrippina and the first betrayal, the first months of Nero's reign, were marked by a false harmony. Agrippina appeared by her son's side. At every public ceremony, she insisted on being present. At official audiences, sat beside the throne, and on some occasions, even answered questions on behalf of the emperor. Rome watched and whispered, some in admiration, others in mocking tones. They called him the emperor's boy, the ruler controlled by a woman. But Nero was changing. At just 17 years old, he began to feel the weight of humiliation and the urge for freedom. He wanted to rule alone. He wanted to be more than a puppet. Seneca and Burrus noticed the first signs of tension. Both advised the young emperor to act cautiously, to avoid open conflict, to control his impulses. But Nero had already made up his mind. The first move was subtle. He began distancing himself from his mother publicly. Official events, where she was once guaranteed to appear, started happening without Agrippina. When questioned, Nero would simply smile and say that his mother needed rest. But behind the scenes, the tension only grew. Agrippina did not accept the exclusion silently. She threatened. She said that if she continued to be ignored, she would reveal secrets, expose past betrayals, and, if necessary, she would make Britannicus the true emperor of Rome. It was a dangerous game, and Nero knew that his political survival depended on one step: to get rid of his mother. The first assassination attempts were discreet. Poisoning attempts failed. Then an ingenious plan, a ceiling that would collapse on Agrippina while she slept. It failed too. Then came the boldest move. He invited her for a reconciliation trip, and during the journey arranged for the boat she was on to sink. The vessel was sabotaged. It collapsed at sea. But Agrippina survived. She swam to shore, injured but alive, and even more furious. Back at the palace, Nero panicked. Seneca and Burrus advised, "There's no more room for hesitation." That night, soldiers were sent to Agrippina's house. When she saw the men arriving, she knew what would happen. It said that her final words before being murdered were directed at the executioner. strike my womb first, it was there that I carried that monster. The news shocked Rome, but within days fear and propaganda silenced any resistance. Nero claimed that his mother had plotted against his life, and the people, in silence, accepted the official version. In the solitude of his chambers, the young emperor had sleepless nights, constant nightmares, visions of his mother appearing in his dreams, bloodied, accusatory. But at dawn he would rise, dress in his finest robes, and smile as if nothing had happened. It was the beginning of a new phase. The Nero, who was once an obedient prince, now was a man who had committed his first great crime. And, tasting blood for the first time, he discovered that absolute power had no limits. Block 5, the Emperor of the Arts, the beginning of an obsession with fame and recognition after Agrippina's death. Something inside Nero broke. If before he had hidden his ambitions behind the mask of a virtuous prince, now the young emperor began to reveal his true face. But contrary to what many expected, his first obsession wasn't war nor absolute political power. It was art. Nero dove headfirst into the world of theater, poetry, and music. He spent hours rehearsing performances, reciting verses he had written himself, singing with a voice trained by private tutors, paid at exorbitant prices. He dreamed not of being remembered as a great strategist, but as the greatest artist Rome had ever seen. At first, the people found it amusing, watching the emperor perform in small private ceremonies was at the very least curious. Some nobles laughed behind his back. Others applauded out of fear. But Nero didn't care. The more he trained, the more his vanity grew. Soon the stage became an addiction. The emperor began organizing large public performances. He summoned senators, generals, common citizens, and forced them to sit through every minute of his long and exhausting shows. The doors were locked. No one could leave before the end. Accounts from the time say that on some nights senators fainted from exhaustion, pregnant women were carried out unconscious, and soldiers faked applause just to avoid angering the emperor. Seneca watched it all in silence. The philosopher no longer had any control over his former student. The promising boy, the young man with potential, was now a man ruled by an ego growing like an uncontrollable beast. Nero began funding the construction of theaters in his own honor. He promoted music festivals where he, of course, was the main attraction. Real artists began to fear him. No one wanted to outshine the emperor. The order was clear. No one can sing better than Nero. But behind this obsession, there was something deeper. Nero had a sick need for approval, for applause, for worship, perhaps an unconscious attempt to fill the emotional void left by his childhood, by rejection, and by the scars of his relationship with his mother. But, as with everything in Nero's life, what began as vanity soon became madness. because while the theaters filled and the applause echoed forced, Rome began to realize it was in the hands of a man who confused the stage with reality, and very soon that confusion would drag the empire into one of the darkest periods in its history. Block 6, The Fall of Seneca. When the voice of reason falls silent. While Nero sank deeper into his obsession with fame and recognition, one figure slowly began to vanish from Rome's decision-making. Seneca, the philosopher who once had been the moral compass of the young emperor, now was merely a powerless spectator. In the early years of Nero's rule, Seneca still had some influence. He could restrain excesses. Moderate impulses guide Nero toward minimally rational political decisions. But as time passed, the emperor began rejecting any form of advice. Their conversations became rare, and when they did happen, Nero listened with an ironic smile, as if tolerating an old man who talked too much. Seneca tried everything. He wrote letters, prepared speeches, appealed to their former bond of master and student. But Nero was no longer the same boy. Now, the throne, the theater, and constant adulation had transformed his mind. He despised moderation, despised prudence, despised anyone who dared to limit him. The distance became inevitable. Seneca requested leave from official duties. He moved to his villa far from the imperial palace. There, he dedicated himself to writing, producing some of his most profound works, reflecting on death, freedom, and the fate of men who dare advise the powerful. But even in isolation, Seneca's name remained a shadow that haunted Nero. The emperor began to see him as a potential enemy. There was fear that the former teacher might lead conspiracies. Rumors spread that conservative senators still sought his counsel. And in Rome, rumors were as dangerous as swords. Nero ordered surveillance. Men were sent to follow Seneca's every step. Letters were intercepted. Friends disappeared. And every gesture from the philosopher was analyzed as a possible sign of treason. The tension reached its peak with the discovery of a real conspiracy. The Piso conspiracy. A group of senators, knights, and officers plotted to assassinate Nero and install a new ruler. When the list of names began circulating, Seneca was mentioned, even without solid evidence. But for Nero, that was enough. The order was simple and cruel. Let him take his own life. It was the Roman way of disguised execution, masked as honor. When soldiers arrived at Seneca's house, the philosopher already seemed to expect them. No tears, no pleas. He simply asked to write one final letter. Then, with calm, he opened the veins in his wrists and recited aloud passages from his own essays. As the blood slowly pooled on the stone floor, Seneca died as he had lived, faithful to his philosophy and fully aware that in Rome truth and virtue rarely survived power. That night, as news spread through alleys and noble halls, Nero toasted, amid yet another musical performance, as if in that very moment one of the last voices of reason in the entire empire had finally fallen silent. Block 7, the Great Fire of Rome. Fire, chaos, and the birth of a monster. Year 64 A.D. It was a stifling night. The wind blew in strange patterns, and the smell of smoke began to spread, even before the first screams echoed through the streets. Rome was on fire. The blaze started in a commercial area near the Circus Maximus, but with the speed of an untamed beast, the flames soon devoured entire neighborhoods, wooden houses, shops, warehouses, temples, all reduced to ashes in a matter of hours, while people fled in desperation, while mothers carried their children, while the elderly collapsed from exhaustion on the hillsides. One question began to rise on every citizen's lips. Where is the emperor? Nero at that moment was far away, but when the news reached him, he rushed back to the city. Upon arriving, he climbed to a high vantage point on the hills, and there before the sea of fire, he did what few could imagine. He picked up his lyre and began to play while reciting verses about the destruction of Troy. At least, that's what history would tell, for centuries to come. The scene became one of the most symbolic in all of Roman history. Nero, the emperor, singing while his city burned. Some would later claim he did it as a gesture of lament. Others that it was pure showmanship. Worse still, that he had ordered the fire to start, just to satisfy an artistic desire to witness a tragedy, leave for 6 days, and 7 nights. The fire consumed nearly 2/3 of Rome. When the flames finally died, the city was unrecognizable. Thousands dead, thousands left homeless, temples, libraries, marketplaces, all in ruins. Nero tried to act quickly. He ordered shelters to be built, distributed food, organized cleanup crews, but public opinion was already turning against him. Whispers that the emperor had been the true culprit spread like the fire itself. In search of a scapegoat, Nero made a decision that would forever change history. He blamed a small religious group, still little known at the time, the Christians. He had dozens arrested, then hundreds, tortured them, executed them, threw them into the arenas, covered their bodies with pitch, and lit them as living torches in the gardens of the palace. The cruelty was so great that even some of his closest allies began to question the emperor's sanity. But for Nero, the fire was more than a tragedy. It was an opportunity. With entire neighborhoods destroyed, he initiated an ambitious rebuilding plan. At the heart of the burned lands, he began to construct the most grandiose and selfish project of his reign, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, an imperial residence of unimaginable proportions, with artificial lakes, marble halls, and entire walls covered in gold. While the people still lived among the ruins, Nero strolled through his new gardens, dreaming of new theatrical plays, new songs, and new applause that he demanded, even if it was forced. At that moment, Rome realized the young emperor, who once promised justice and peace, had now become something entirely different. A man who preferred to see the city in flames, if that meant staying at the center of everyone's attention. A man who, to feed his vanity, was willing to destroy his own empire. Block 8, the Domus Aurea, the Palace of Megalomania. After the Great Fire, while smoke still lingered over Rome's ruins, Nero revealed to the world his true project. While thousands of citizens struggled to rebuild their homes, while the Senate debated emergency measures, the emperor dreamed of a palace unlike anything the world had ever seen, named Domus Aurea, or the Golden House. The construction would become the most ambitious in Rome's history. Nero didn't want just a residence. He wanted a symbol, a physical extension of his own vanity, a monument to his greatness and to his insanity. Rome's most renowned architects were summoned. The finest artisans brought from every province of the empire, white marble columns imported from Greece, ceilings decorated with pure gold, entire rooms covered in precious stones, perfumed fountains releasing rare fragrances, and a massive artificial lake reflecting the light of thousands of burning torches. But the highlight was reserved for the grand central hall, a rotating dome moved by a system of pulleys and slaves, designed to turn slowly following the movement of the sun, so that the emperor would always be illuminated, as if he were a deity. At the center, a colossal statue of Nero, over 30 meters tall, depicting him as the sun god himself. It was more than architecture. It was a delusion of power, carved in stone and gold. The cost was astronomical to fund the project. Nero raised taxes, confiscated properties, and forced entire provinces to send resources and labor. The people still living among the wreckage watched with a mix of anger and fear as golden walls rose in the heart of the city. While strolling through the still unfinished corridors, Nero smiled. He organized new parties, recited new poems, and, in his moments of solitude, walked along the artificial lake, imagining himself immortal. Some senators began to murmur. They called the Domus Aurea the Palace of Megalomania. Others said that with every stone laid, Rome sank deeper into moral decay. But no one dared to confront him. Those who did disappeared. Those who criticized were exiled, or worse, condemned. In rigged trials, the Domus Aurea became a symbol of what Nero had become, a man who no longer distinguished reality from spectacle. To him, ruling was performing, reigning was being the star of a drama where everyone else were mere extras. And so, while golden halls expanded, while ceilings filled with celestial paintings, Rome braced itself for the next acts of the tragedy, yet to come, because the shine of gold could never hide the darkness that already dominated the emperor's heart. Block 9, the executions, the betrayals, and the spiral into madness, with the shine of the Domus Aurea, reflecting Nero's power, came also the darkest and most violent phase of his reign. The emperor now saw himself as a misunderstood artist, a genius under siege, a constant target of envy and conspiracies, and for every suspicious glance, for every rumor, for every whisper of doubt, he responded with blood. Executions became routine. Senators, former allies, military officers, even members of his own family, fell one by one. All it took was a rumor, an anonymous accusation, or simply a look of distrust. Nero no longer needed proof, nor trials. All it took was a whim. Friends turned into enemies. Overnight, men who had drunk with him, laughed with him, now marched toward the dungeons or to public execution grounds. The city lived in a state of terror. People whispered in the streets, afraid that any word might be misinterpreted. Nero, in turn, seemed increasingly isolated and paranoid. He spent sleepless nights, wandered the corridors of the Domus Aurea, talking to himself. He had visions, heard voices, and in many accounts was seen talking to his own reflection, as if on the other side of the mirror there was someone who understood him. Fear turned into delusions of persecution. He began disguising himself at night, roamed Rome's streets, under dark cloaks, attacking random citizens with his own hands, as if he were a common thug, laughing as people fled in terror. He was the emperor turned into a ghost, who haunted his own city with no one able to stop him. And as if that weren't enough, the hunger for blood continued. With every new accusation, Nero made sure to personally witness the executions, some in arenas, others in private halls, where, surrounded by musicians and servants, he applauded as screams of pain echoed off the walls. The Senate, powerless, merely watched. Some tried to buy time by flattering the emperor. Others conspired in secret, dreaming of a way to get rid of him. But everyone knew that the price of a mistake was death. And at the center of it all, Nero sank deeper into the spiral of madness. Between one musical performance and the next, between a poem and an execution, he no longer distinguished reality from imagination. He no longer saw faces, only threats. He no longer heard advice, only voices of paranoia. Inside his own mind, Rome watched in silence as its emperor descended into the abyss, and for many, the question was no longer if, but when and how it would all come to an end. Block 10, the final fall, solitude, escape, and Nero's death. The year was 68 A.D. Rome was no longer the same. The people exhausted, the treasury empty, the Senate silent but burning with hatred, and in the provinces generals began rising one by one, the legions who once swore loyalty to the emperor, now sent letters declaring support for new leaders. Their rebellion was taking shape. The empire stood on the edge of collapse. While everything crumbled, Nero still refused to accept reality. He spent his days reciting poetry, playing his lyre, organizing private performances, while news from rebellious provinces arrived one after another. Friends vanished, allies disappeared, advisors abandoned the palace, one by one, and when Nero finally called for help, there was no one left to answer. On a June night, the Praetorian Guard, until then his last line of defense, publicly declared they would no longer protect him. The Senate moved quickly and declared Nero an enemy of Rome. The sentence was clear: death by reason of tyranny. Upon hearing the news, Nero panicked. He ran through the halls of the Domus Aurea, called for soldiers, for servants, for any familiar face, but no one came. Alone, barefoot, and desperate, he fled through Rome's streets, covered by a simple cloak, trying not to be recognized. A few friends still risked following him, among them a former slave and 2 loyal servants. Together they hid in a humble house on the outskirts of the city. There Nero trembled. His mind swung between moments of clarity and bouts of delirium. He asked again and again, "Is this really the end of Nero?" While hiding, he heard in the distance the cavalry approaching. The Senate had sent soldiers to capture him. As footsteps echoed louder and louder, Nero turned to his servants and asked one final question. "Is there no way I can escape this shame, realizing there was no way out?" He grabbed a dagger. For long minutes he hesitated. His hands trembled. Fear paralyzed him. He begged one of his attendants to have the courage to do for him what he couldn't do himself, but no one had it. And as the soldiers knocked on the door, in one final act of desperation, Nero drove the blade into his own neck. It is said that as the blood flowed, his last words were, "What an artist the world is losing." In that instant, the man who once enchanted Rome with his youth, who ruled with promises of peace, who got lost in vanity, fear, and madness, died alone, without glory, without friends, without applause. Rome breathed a sigh of relief, and as Nero's body was hurriedly buried, the empire prepared for a new chapter. But his name would never be forgotten. For centuries, Nero would remain the eternal symbol of how absolute power can destroy a man from the inside out.